Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm State Senator Jason Lewis. Thank you so much for joining us for our community conversation on racial justice. I've been hosting community conversations for several years now. The goal is to shed light on important issues affecting our communities and to help foster constructive dialogue. I want to start tonight by thanking Kate Castillo, Sarah Zyberg, and Zach Crowley from my office for all their hard work in organizing tonight's event. As we begin our conversation, we should acknowledge that we are streaming to you from land that is the traditional territory of Native peoples, including the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts. As I'm sure you know, this past weekend, we celebrated Juneteenth. 2 years ago, I was proud to join my colleagues in the state legislature in voting to make Juneteenth an official state holiday. Last year, President Biden signed legislation to make Juneteenth National Independence Day a national holiday, the first new public holiday since Martin Luther King Day was established in 1983. President Obama once said, "Juneteenth has never been a celebration of victory or an acceptance of the way things are. It's a celebration of progress. It's an affirmation that despite the most painful parts of our history, change is possible, and there is still so much work to do." Indeed, centuries of racial oppression and discrimination in this country have resulted in deep and persistent racial inequities in all facets of our society, from vast racial wealth gaps to housing and school segregation, health disparities, environmental injustices, and more. In the greater Boston area, the median net worth of a white family is almost $250,000. While for a Black family, it is just $8. And as shocking as this statistic is, the pandemic has likely widened this racial wealth gap even more, as hard as that is to believe. And to cite just one more disturbing example of racial inequality in our communities, consider the fact that Black infants die at a rate 2.5 times greater than do white infants, and Black youth die from violence 26 times more frequently than do white youth. To build a more just and a more equitable society, we have to start by facing our nation's history truthfully. We have to acknowledge that white supremacy and systemic racism are deeply embedded in our institutions and our culture. At the same time, we should also appreciate and celebrate the hard-fought progress led primarily by people of color that has been made over the years to advance civil rights and racial justice here in Massachusetts and across our nation. In the state legislature, we have made some significant strides in advancing racial justice in recent years, and just wanted to share with you a few examples. Passage of the Student Opportunity Act in 2019 to provide more equitable funding for our public schools, particularly those that serve lower income communities and communities with large numbers of students of color. Major criminal justice and policing reforms to address racial bias. Creation of a new Office of Health Equity to address the social determinants of health and racial and ethnic health disparities. Establishing a new legislative committee on racial equity, civil rights, and inclusion to put racial justice and fostering greater equity in the forefront of the work that we are doing in the state legislature. Launching a process to replace our current state seal and flag, which have offensive Native American imagery. And hopefully soon, the signing into law of the Crown Act to prohibit discrimination against natural hairstyles. Of course, none of this progress happened on its own. It took tremendous work and grassroots activism from many dedicated and courageous individuals and organizations, like 15-year-old Black twins Maya and Deanna Cook, who inspired and fought for passage of the Crown Act. And I am so proud to represent them in the state Senate as Malden residents. Of course, there is still so much more work that needs to be done. This work requires each of us to educate ourselves about racial justice. It requires each of us to work to be actively anti-racist. Tonight's community conversation is designed to help us in doing this work. We are fortunate to have a fantastic panel of speakers who will share their thoughts with us, and then we will welcome your questions for our panelists and engage in a robust discussion. Please go ahead as we go through the conversation and write your questions into the Facebook comments as we go along, and then we will be able to pose your questions to our panelists. I should note that there are a number of important terms that you will likely hear tonight in our conversation. So we've also taken the liberty of creating a resource guide that we hope will be helpful. And Kate will now post a link to the resource guide in the Facebook comments. And I encourage you, when you have a chance, to check this out. We also welcome your feedback on this resource guide and any additional suggestions you have for organizations or resources that we should include. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our first panelist. Dr. Lori Nasiah Jefferson is the director of the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy at UMass Boston and graduate program director for the Gender Leadership and Public Policy Graduate Certificate Program. She previously held positions in the academic and healthcare arena in both the public and private sectors, including serving as Director of Health Disparities at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Health Policy Analyst at the Civil Rights Project at Harvard Law School, Research Scientist for the New Jersey Department of Health and Senior Services, and Senior Research Associate at Columbia University School of Public Health. Dr. Nasiah Jefferson has received numerous fellowships and awards, including the Harry S. Leviton Award for Excellence and Leadership in Education. Her research interests and areas of expertise include intersectionality, social and health policy, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She holds a BA in African and Afro-American Studies and Politics from Brandeis, a Master's in Public Health from Yale, a Master's in Women and Gender Studies from Brandeis, and a PhD in Social Policy with a concentration in Health Policy from Brandeis. Dr. Nasiah Jefferson, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Perhaps you could get our conversation started by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in your work and your thoughts on the state of racial justice here in Massachusetts and across our nation.
Sure. It's really, first of all, I just want you to know that it is an absolute honor to be here this evening, and to talk about racial justice is critical and timely. And I, as a Black woman, address and think about racial equity, racism every day of my life. It is part and parcel to who I am. I grew up with a family who were very much civil rights and community activists. We were involved in the NAACP, the Urban League, fair housing legislation, the METCO program. We really were at the forefront. And when I say we, my parents were at the forefront. And they, as a young child, took me everywhere they went to the meetings. So it was actually in my blood. It was something that I could not walk away from. As a young child, I went on the Martin Luther King marches with my parents. I went to the national conferences, again, of the Urban League, the NAACP. My son has worked in Congress with the Congressional Black Caucus. And now he's working with a Black firm that's addressing social issues as well in Washington, D.C. And, I came to this work honestly from that perspective, but I grew up in a predominantly white city. I grew up actually in Newton, and I witnessed white privilege both from a financial and an economic and a social perspective. So I knew that there was a gap between what I experienced as an African American child and what some of my classmates were experiencing. I also experienced racism in white settings. And I can remember one thing that was quite important. When I was young, the Massachusetts Turnpike extension actually went right through the African American community in Newton. There are actually 7 streets in Newton, and through eminent domain, we had to give up our homes. And what we found out as time went on is that the Black families in Newton were given less money for their homes than the white families. And many of the families in Newton could no longer afford to live there. My mother was also a MECO director in the city. And so she also saw the disparities in terms of what the children were experiencing in school in reference to being stereotyped. And so again, this is something that just came to me naturally in terms of my upbringing. And as I moved forward in my young adult life, I became involved in issues related to women of color, reproductive health. I learned about gendered racism and disparities in health and social outcomes. And one of the things I learned, early on was that African Americans and other communities of color did not have enough representation in terms of addressing core issues relating to their health disparities, whether it's in terms of health care or health status. Also came to find out that there was not enough research being done in reference to thinking about health and social outcomes. And so this propelled me to move forward, saying that there needed to be more work in this area. So I did focus on public health. But what I do want to say, that I am now, again, the director for the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. And the work that I do actually takes an intersectional perspective and trying to understand that all forms of oppression actually reinforce each other. And so the work that we do at this center focuses on graduate education, research and policy analysis, and also work relating to a New England Women's Policy Initiative and a Distinguished Public Service Fellows Program. I mention all that to say that when we educate our students and when we work within our communities and we community engage, we think about the fact that if we are a person of color, if I am a person of color, then I could also be a woman. I could also be someone who's foreign born, and how these intersections actually complicate and in many instances actually exacerbate discrimination that's experienced. So I just want to say again, as a Black woman, this work to me is absolutely personal. To me, racism in many forms is immoral, it's unethical, and it's a Scrooge on society. And one of the things I want to mention before, I close in reference to this particular question is that the Massachusetts Taxpayer Association did some really important work. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but their 29-page report basically said one thing that I thought is really very important. And it basically said that Massachusetts' gross state product would increase by $25 billion over the 5 years for the Commonwealth to close the racial divide in wages, housing, investments, and wealth. And so you can just see that racism and racial inequities, what they cause is for our Commonwealth not to be as wealthy and strong as it could be. This is not just about morality and ethics, although that's one thing it's about, but it's also about making the best for our Commonwealth.
Thank you so much. And that is such an important point, that every single one of us has a stake in advancing racial justice and making our communities more just and equitable. So thank you very much, Dr. Nassai Jefferson, for getting us our conversation started tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second panelist. City Councillor Manjula Karamchetty was elected to the Melrose City Council in 2021. She represents Ward 1. She's also the co-founder of the Melrose Racial Justice Community Coalition and serves on Melrose Mayor Broder's DEI task force. She's the Director of Equity and Student Support at the High Meadows Graduate School of Teaching and Learning, where she leads all student support initiatives, including advising, counseling services, and postgraduate mentoring, and coordinates all their DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She previously worked as a counselor, educator, and administrator in various diverse school districts. Her areas of expertise and passion include promoting equity and access for all learners, as well as the design and delivery of authentic social emotional learning and mental health programs. Councillor Karamchetty earned her BS from Colorado State University, as well as master's degrees from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She is a licensed school counselor. Councillor Karamchetty, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So perhaps you could also tell us a bit more about yourself, how you got started in your racial justice work, and your thoughts about the work that you've been doing both professionally and locally in the city of Melrose to advance racial justice.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Senator Lewis. I feel like you covered so much. And I just want to say how grateful I am for this opportunity to speak with the other panelists and to be a part of the community that's thinking about racial justice and how to move forward and keep progressing. A little bit about me. So my parents are immigrants from India. They came here in the 60s. Prior to coming here, my grandparents, who I really feel that I stand on the shoulders of, they participated in the Salt Marches with Gandhi and were really active in trying to move India forward in a peaceful but strong way. So I appreciated what was said before in terms of it's in my blood. I feel like it's a little bit in my blood too. I grew up in a predominantly white Catholic town in Massachusetts. And right away, when my family moved into town, neighbors were concerned that the property value of the homes in the neighborhood would be going down because an Indian family from a diverse background moved in. And that's sort of the climate of which what really, solidified for me was more about how to make sure that people feel welcome, people feel like they belong, and that people have equal access to opportunities. My parents came to this country for educational opportunities, and, based on their struggle, I was able to access a lot of opportunities through education. But really, in terms of my racial justice work, I started as a DEI, a diversity trainer in the 1990s as part of my graduate school work. And I've always really approached this work actually as a learner in terms of trying to understand the history of systemic racism in our country, how policies that have been designed have really influenced sort of the where we are now. And then as a part of that work, particularly in education, really trying to dismantle those systems that have created data where our Black and Brown students aren't having the same outcomes as some of our more white, privileged, socioeconomically advantaged students. So for me, that work really started in the school counseling field as a school counselor in a college and career center, and just figuring out how to remove barriers, how to remove obstacles within policies and procedures that were really targeting our students of color in many ways and keeping them from the opportunities that they were just as much able to succeed at if given the information, if provided the outreach, and given the opportunity, which sort of all led to my work as the Director of Equity and Student Support at the High Meadows Graduate School of Teaching and Learning, we really take a justice and equity approach in our teacher education program. And it stems from really, again, studying systemic racism, the history of our country, and incorporating things like redlining, incorporating things like segregation, because without that lens on history, it's hard to understand how we got here. And then it's really hard to understand how to move forward and progress. So we're teaching that to people who are seeking to become teachers in our schools, so they don't become part of the problem. They're learning how in their classrooms and in their schools and in their districts, how to design learning experiences that are representative, that are culturally proficient, culturally sustaining, and really design based on assets, and really thinking outside the box of what it means, what assets students are bringing into the classroom, what assets families have, and designing around those, as opposed to like the way things have always been done and the traditional way of which schools have always been set up. And, you know, in terms of Melrose, I would say that my work has really focused on, again, listening and learning to our Black and Brown community, how to use my own power and privilege in regards to advocacy, and how to build coalitions. I think, you know, it's something we'll talk about later, but I just believe that we are so much stronger together in this work. And it's really like coming together as a city, as schools, and a community to move us forward, and creating principles and just like figuring it out together and having brave conversations and figuring out what we want to do and being patient and being persistent in that work. So I think I will stop there because I know there are questions and things that people will ask after our next panelist comes in.
That was great. Thank you so much. And such an important part of this conversation, you know, how we approach our curriculum and our culture in our public schools, and how we prepare our educators and administrators to be able to provide that kind of inclusive culture and curriculum. I know that's something that our next panelist has thought a lot about, and I'm sure we'll touch on. Before I introduce our third panelist, let me just remind our audience, again, thank you so much for joining us. And please go ahead, any questions as we go along that you have for any or all of our panelists, please go ahead and just type those into the Facebook comments. So we'll be able to ask your questions to our panelists in just a moment. So now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our third and our final panelist this evening. Mai Du has been a community advocate and activist since the early 1990s. She is the co-founder and a board member of the Greater Malden Asian American Community Coalition, and also serves as a board member for the United States Dragon and Lion Dance Federation, the South Cove Community Health Center, the Asian Community Development Corporation, and Maria Drost Counseling Services. As a youth leader, Ms. Du helped to found the Coalition for Asian Pacific American Youth, which engaged youth all across Massachusetts to give voice and visibility to AAPI youth experiences and to work towards positive social change. More recently, she co-founded the Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity in Education to champion legislation that promotes anti-racism in our public schools. And I've had the great privilege of working closely with her and the coalition on this legislation. Ms. Du operates and teaches at her own martial arts establishment, the Wah Lam Kung Fu and Tai Chi Academy in Malden and Quincy. She earned both her undergraduate degree and a master's degree in education from Tufts University. Ms. Du, it's wonderful to see you and have you with us tonight. So perhaps you could also tell us a bit more about yourself, how you got started in your work, which you've been doing for decades, and your thoughts about racial justice work that you've been doing both in the city of Malden and beyond.
Well, good evening. It is such a pleasure to be a part of this panel discussion with with the esteemed fellow panelists. Thank you for this opportunity. What an important topic that you're covering, Senator, and we're very grateful for this conversation. How I got started with this work 30 years ago, I was doing the math, was that when I was in high school at Malden High, as a young refugee background Asian American student. And back then I did not even identify myself as Asian American, but just an Asian student. Had not gone through a personal identity journey and understanding my place in society and what it meant to be a part of the American social fabric. It started in high school where I felt that I just didn't understand how I belong in the larger school environment and the school system. And one of the teachers at the high school, Ms. Kwong, invited me to go to a meeting with AAPI youth across the state to talk about growing up Asian. There was a racial incident at Boston Latin Academy back then in the mid-90s, and the students organized a walkout, and community leaders were supporting them for the very first time. And so the adults in the community said it's time that we gather young people across the state to learn about each other's experiences as Asian American, and then talk about some of the solutions that they can come together and try to work towards to create positive change. And I was very shy. I was incredibly insecure with my English because I came as a refugee. I did not even speak one word of English when I came, living in Chelsea, Massachusetts, as coming from Vietnam. And so it was my first time. It was very eye-opening and a turning point in my life where I was able to meet Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, South Asian, Indian Americans, Thai, Laotian. I mean, it was just a very diverse. And for the first time, I felt that, number one, that I was known as Asian. I thought I was just Chinese from Vietnam. And so there was a label that eventually became practical, but also a social construct of what it means politically and socially, historically. And that I felt that I was not alone. And that was the beginning of my journey. I would say that what keeps me going and engaged in this work and continuously in the 30 years is that I would say I feel like I don't have a choice. As a person of color, as an AAPI female, with the many intersectionalities of being refugee, immigrant, and more, that racism and white supremacy and the oppressive system is really a part of the reality of my world, and that it's survival sometimes, especially during this current climate of anti-Asian hate. We have to do something. I have to do something to create that change and be part of the change. Oftentimes, I wish that there are weekends and evenings when I'm actually doing social justice work, racial justice work, DEI work, and community organizing, that I would have that privilege to not do it, just like others who enjoy white privilege and other resources and privileges to be able to just not worry about the oppressive structure, but there's no choice. And so I would say that that it is a part of survival, in many ways. But at the same time, I stand on the shoulders of so many inspiring leaders that have paved the path for us to have the progress that we've made as a country, as a society, as a local community. So many before me, beside me, working together, very inspired hardworking and passionate community leaders, very diverse leaders in all realms. and also those who are just right behind me, the youth leaders, the youth activists that we see so activated at this current time. And I was once a youth organizer, youth activist myself. So this is why I do this work. And I've shared this before. There's this quote by Confucius that if you think in terms of 1 year, you plant rice. When you think in terms of 10 years, you plant a tree. And when you think in terms of 100 years, you teach children. I dedicate my racial justice organizing activism work in the area of education because I believe that it is such an important place where we can address the foundation of and the roots of a lot of the oppression and the racist structure that is so much a reality of American fabric, and that we have to hone into the education of our children. They learn it somewhere, and if they are going to be in school learning something and to be successful citizens of our 21st century, we should incorporate teaching anti-racism and cultural responsive education in the classrooms, outside the classrooms, as a part of the academic experiences. I was fortunate to have had that the ethnic studies experience and curriculum when I attended Tufts University and my community activism at UMass Boston. And so this is a part of why it's so important to advocate for anti-racist education, cultural responsive education, particularly incorporating ethnic studies that will allow for our students and our young ones to have windows and mirrors so that they can see themselves for who they truly are, and windows for them to see their peers as well. And from all of us being able to see ourselves and others for who we truly are, and embrace our identity, and with integrity, with dignity, with real history and facts, as how things have been and can be better, we can move together as a community, as a nation, stronger and more hopeful in ways where we can advance solidarity together. So currently, some of the things that I'm working on, in addition to Senator's introduction, are working with projects that work with educators of color, diverse youth, to get them to become civic leaders, and hopefully, and thank you, Senator Lewis, for your help in the earmark work with exploring the establishment of an Asian American Community Center in Greater Malden, addressing, of course, with that work, addressing AAPI hate, anti-Asian hate, but also to address the mental health, mental well-being of folks in the community, particular people of color, and also the racial trauma that's a part of that as a result of white supremacy. But at the end of the day, I think that building solidarity and working collaboratively with diverse communities all across the state, as well as intergenerationally, is very, very important to advance racial justice. And it has to be the way that we have to work together. So this conversation is critical and timely, and I thank you for your work on it.
Thank you so much. It really is a remarkable journey you've been on, for coming to this country as a refugee, as you said, who didn't speak a word of English, to the impact that you've had on so many people and the Greater Malden community over these past decades. So grateful for your work. To all three of you for incredible work. You really are inspiring leaders. All right, so let's bring up Kate. Let's bring up all of our panelists. And we've got plenty of time now to take some questions from our audience. I have some questions as well that I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on. And we're going to make this, kind of as much of a conversation as possible. So, I may pose a question, start out with one of you, but feel free to just jump in at any time. So, Kate, I think we have some questions from the audience. Do you want to put up the first question so we can see it? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So from Ian Abasan, I think is interested in some more specific examples in your work and your experience of how, racial justice progress has been achieved, and better understanding approaches to anti-racist activism. I know you all have a lot of experience with that and kind of what techniques work better than others. So that's a great place to start. So maybe I'm sure you each would love to comment on this. So maybe we'll go around and start with Dr. Nasaya Jefferson. Do you want to go first here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that you can address racial justice in a number of different ways. You can address it through research. You can address it through activism. You can address it through education and teaching. And you can connect it also to collaborative community engagement. Some of the work that we've been involved with at the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy is working on issues relating to birth equity. Birth equity is critically important. We know that the maternal mortality rate for African American women is 3 to 4 times higher. We also know about, infant mortality, preterm delivery. And so one of the things that, we've been doing at the center is saying, yes, it's important for us to understand what are the impacts of gendered racism on birth outcomes. Because a lot of times when we're thinking about birth outcomes, we're thinking about, what does a woman eat? What is her nutrition like? But we don't actually think about those social determinants. And one huge social determinant that has been proven, time over is the fact that racism impacts on birth outcomes. But we don't understand how we think about that in reference to women of color specifically, and why gendered racism is very important. But the other thing that we don't do enough is we don't listen to the voices of women. Women of color, in African American women specifically. We don't listen to their voices in terms of what they need, what do they want. And so one of the things we know about, women, particularly and women of color more so, is that we are silenced at every turn. And so some of this work that we're doing is in collaboration actually with individuals in the communities. And actually Representative Liz Miranda was a strong supporter of our particular project as they were moving forward in reference to the Maternal Inequities Commission. So, this is one way in which we can address racial justice. Another way is that we are working with the Collins Center for Public Management, and we're actually working with municipalities relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, and helping communities think about how can they make their communities more inclusive, how can they make their internal operations within government more inclusive. And part of that is anti-racism. In terms of the work that we were doing, we decided we weren't going to just say diversity, equity, and inclusion. We were going to say diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism to make it really clear that, these things are, critically important. In terms of thinking about, young people, and we're also addressing issues relating to racial justice and technology. Technology is something that is the wave of the future, and it's actually here to stay. And how do we make sure that we understand what are the implications of technology in terms of how it can help and also how it can hurt the racial justice effort moving forward? And part of that is making sure that we have young people of color, actually in the field of technology, but being critical players in the field of technology, just not being technology experts, but beginning to move the field in such a way that we're looking at algorithmic bias and other ways in which technology can be harmful, and making sure that those things can happen. And I think the other thing is we have to think about, political representation and making sure that we have people of color, women and other people of color, men of color in office to represent the issues. And if we look at, the number of women and we look at the number of women of color in the state house right now, it's very, very small. And so we know that everyone can help to represent no matter your race and ethnicity, but there's something that comes along with having experienced racism, having experienced discrimination, and then being able to say that I am here because I understand your experience and moving forward. I think when you begin to think about, these kinds of efforts relating to addressing strategy to address racism come in many ways. And one of the things that we know is that usually you need to use multi-pronged approaches. It's not just using one way to make something happen. So one of the things I think is really important, we think about coalition building, that being very important, but it's really interesting because when you're thinking about coalition building, it's important that we're thinking about it in the sense that coalitions have equal say, because sometimes coalitions may not be that way. So how do we make sure that coalitions are equal in terms of their approaches? If we look at the civil rights projects, the civil rights movement, we'll understand that the civil rights movement had so much to do with sit-ins and all the things that happened before 1964 influenced so much. And so what we know is the civil rights movement called to national attention, and this was basically related to protest, and that helped to promote desegregated public accommodations like restaurants and movie theaters and the South and beyond. And those actions, again, they influenced the approval of the Civil Rights Act, moving forward. We also note that if we begin to think about, I'll give you a perfect example. When I was teaching at a university before I came to UMass Boston, the African-American students took over the administration building. And what was nice about it was the African-American students took over the administration building, but they did it in concert with their classmates who were Latino and Jewish and Asian and Arab. And they basically said, we are not moving. We have 13 demands. And they stayed there for 12 days and they negotiated with leadership. And after 12 days, they actually were able to have 12 of the 13 demands met. So that in itself was something that students came together and said, this is very important. And again, that came on the heels of the Black Lives Matter movement. The students probably would not have had that same impetus had there not been a national movement behind them, and that particular national movement moving onto college campuses. And then they all supported each other in that education. I could go on, but I just want to say what we find is that there's normally multi-pronged approaches, and multi-pronged approaches really are the best way in order to move forward in reference to making change, in reference to racial justice. And also we know that it's a long, slow, persistent push to move us there. And so patience and persistence and not giving up are critically important to this work. There's work that I was doing 20 years ago in reference to reproductive health justice, and some of that work you're doing again. And sometimes you're doing that work again because you might have one and then there's a retrenchment and you have to do it all over again, or sometimes you never got there. But the main thing is not to stop and to bring people along with you, including allies.
If I could jump in.
Absolutely, please.
I just wanted to start with a quote that was actually created by two members of the Melrose Racial Justice Community Coalition, Reverend Jerron Green and Eugenia Gibbons. And, it's something that I keep with me all the time. And it is, Untangling and dismantling racism is messy, painful business. It takes time. There are no silver bullets, easy answers, or overnight solutions. The process is iterative, and there will be missteps along the way. However, the only way our community is going to effectively change the system is to organize, and often that means organizing from the ground up. And I share that because it's so big, right? Dismantling racism. And I really appreciate the question in the chat around specific examples. And I'm going to share a few, and they're probably going to feel small, and they're definitely more local. But I think a lot of these examples that I will give build on each other, and they sort of model what is possible, and then it can build and build and build with that persistence and consistency that you just spoke about. So a couple of things that I just wanted to share. I love that you were in the Malden Public Schools, because I used to be the director of guidance, testing, and academic support for the Malden Public Schools. And one of the things that we were looking at was our AP enrollment, advanced placement enrollment in higher level, academically rigorous courses. And what we noticed in the data is that many actual schools in Massachusetts, but also around the country, our Black and Brown students weren't enrolling in AP courses. And so, being enrolled in AP courses really is something that prepares students for the rigors of higher education. So something we wanted to do was figure out, how do we get more of our Black and Brown students who we believe are capable enrolled in our AP courses? So first we started with the kids, and we're like, hey, how come you're not taking AP classes? And, we got a variety of responses. I wasn't recommended by my teacher. I didn't know that AP courses were important. I just, no one told me that AP courses were important. None of my other friends were taking AP courses. I enrolled in an AP course once, but I was the only Black or Brown student in that class. So, one of our first steps was listening to the students. But then we really started to look at, okay, well, what are the barriers? What are the policies that exist in our school and in our district that keep students from accessing AP classes? And it was sort of, you needed a certain grade in a course. You needed certain behaviors. You needed a certain persona to be recommended for those classes. And we said, hey, you know what? If any student wants to take an AP class, you know what? They can take it. We're going to get rid of those, you have to have an A or B in our class. We're going to get rid of, you have to have perfect attendance. And then we're going to figure out ways to support our students who haven't taken an AP class before. And so it was a lot of that, it was messy. We had to work with teachers to say, it's okay that the student didn't have an A in your math class. They can still take an AP course. And what we were able to do over time, working collectively, teachers, administrators, community organizations, is we were able to raise not only the enrollment, but the success of Black and Brown students in AP courses, to the point where the principal of the Malden Public Schools at the time and myself were invited to speak at the college board at the national conference because of the work we were able to do. So I would say that is one example, using data, working with students, working with teachers, administrators. So that's one example. I think another example that I'd love to share is through the Racial Justice Community Coalition in Melrose that we started. And the AP work was pre-George Floyd. The Melrose Racial Justice Community Coalition was established in the wake of George Floyd and what we all witnessed and knew was wrong and couldn't happen. But so we decided to create this Racial Justice Community Coalition. But what was vital in this community coalition was to center Black and Brown voices. And so while we had a diverse array of Melrosians, we really wanted to centralize the voices of our Black and Brown Melrose residents and learned from them what we should focus on. And through those conversations, the things that the community wanted us to focus on, our historically marginalized population, was representation in the curriculum, representation in terms of the recruitment and retention of teachers of color in our public schools, but also the recruitment and retention of, just like you had stated earlier, representation in government and local government, representation of like City Hall having more people of color on staff. And so we identified those goals and then really started to partner with the school district, partner with the mayor's office, and identify and earmark some funds to do a DEI survey, which we're actually releasing the results to the community tomorrow in a public forum. And working with the school department around like, what does it mean to represent in the curriculum? And through some DESE grants, they were able to get some funding to really work on that. We're not done, but we are moving forward together. And it really stems from what our historically marginalized populations in Melrose, what our Black and Brown students and families want to see happen in our system. And we are moving the needle on that. We are starting to hire more teachers of color. We are seeing more representation in our curriculum K-12. The mayor's office in City Hall is doing more work around DEI. And so that would be sort of my second example. And then I want to share one from my graduate school, in that, we are a graduate school of teaching and learning, and we've designed sort of our principles for how we do everything. So we have what we call JEDI principles: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And everything we do, and I'm going to read them off to you because I don't have them memorized, but so everything we do, whether it's advising, it's curriculum, it's observations in the classroom, within each of our like core competencies, because we're a competency-based program, are we designing for the end result of equal access and opportunity for diverse populations? Are we designing for flexibility and to be able to shift for different populations? Are we designing in ways that honor and incorporate a variety of strengths, assets, passions, and experiences? And are we designing by questioning our own experiences, our bias, our traditions, and our expectations, so that we are aware of them and we challenge our own thinking in terms of how to support others? So these are just 3 examples. And while they are not ending racism by any means, these are steps we are taking to move the needle forward. And as we do that work, we will continue to grow and learn on what to do next. So I share those as hopefully some concrete examples of how to do the work on the ground.
Those are fabulous examples. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those. Mai, did you want to also comment on this question?
Yes, I do. Sorry, the mic was going on and off. Thank you for these great examples, and I'm going to piggyback on both panelists' great strategies and examples. I want to come back to education. The counselor talked about the role of the educator who can really set the trajectory of a student's success, and perhaps even college admission and the type of college that a certain student will get accepted to and be able to build upon for success. Educators, school counselors are really important in the journey of any student, particularly students of color. When we talk about diversifying, educators and curriculum and whatnot, we really need to think through that when these educators of color eventually get into the classrooms, that they have adequate support, that they are well trained, equipped with resources, and continue to be heard and respected in ways that are not tokenized, and that they have a strategy of growing into leadership positions where they can continue to bring up other educators of color, and also to understand that our white educators can play huge roles in ensuring that the experiences of students, all students, students of color and white students, to be able, like I mentioned earlier, windows and mirrors, that they all can possess windows and mirrors so that they understand each other and can support each other and be very effective 21st century citizens, global citizens. Because at the end of the day, when we can learn to be effective colleagues and friends and neighbors of each other in a very, very diverse community, a very diverse global economy, we all benefit. I mean, Dr. Nasai Jefferson said earlier, the race is a huge factor in the wealth of the state and the country as well, and how well we do. So so the success of students, and all students of color, having gone through good, meaningful, effective anti-racist curriculum with very effective and meaningful staff support, educator support, school counselors, school leaders. These are individuals that really set the path for them to succeed. So I thank the counselor for bringing that up as a good example, and I just want to ensure that we do want to keep looking towards the schools, the curriculum, the education system, the districts, and how our entire Commonwealth can support anti-racist education, cultural responsive education. I want to go back to Dr. Nasai Jefferson's point about supporting those who are in office, candidates of color, elected officials of color who are doing this work courageously. We need to ensure that we support them and keep them in positions of leadership and decision making. And how do we do that? We have to make sure that we knock on doors, support their campaign, volunteer, and donate and vote. These are just civic engagement actions that is so critical. And Senator, I have to say, since I gotten involved with the CARE legislation, I continue to learn how important it is to support those elected officials who are having, the courage and their and the work to do this work to keep pushing things forward, so to move the needle on racial justice. So support candidates, support young people who are interested on this path, get them into internships, externships, mentorships, positions where they can taste and experience what it's like to be inside a state house working, and have training on lobbying and budgeting and all that. And that's part of what CARE's Leadership Next Gen program will look to do, and we're hopeful that could be something that we can work with Commonwealth Seminar to get them training for and experiences on. But with all that, voting is so important. So we have to make sure we do voters education and registration, ensuring that challenges to the voting experience and access and all that. We need to address that, and that comes down to language access as well, right? Many communities, especially the Asian American communities, we want to make sure that when it comes down to voting, language access is there to provide an equitable experience, and therefore we can have political voice and power. Now, going back to the council's point about DEI, I think that we all can see that DEI is a movement right now. JEDI, DEI, whatever we have it, in whatever terms that it's meant, either as a DEI coordinator or officer, or even department, if we're lucky enough to have that again, we have to look at the real design, right? You talked about design, the real design in the work and in the positions, and how that position is being supported, funded, and what kind of power is given to that position, that department. The racial justice, racism, white supremacy, it is so complicated and so messy, as we heard. That is not just one position and it's going to take care of the whole city's problem on on racism and inclusion issue. So we have to really examine how it's designed, how it's implemented, how it's supported, what kind of budget does it have, and who is really backing up the voice of people who are doing the DEI work. Because at the end of the day, if that's not well supported and designed and implemented and also given power to have to hold accountable the people who have been perpetuating white supremacy, we're not going to move the needle in a real way. It's just going to be lip service and tokenization. So we need to make sure that, you know, we are critical and we examine the dollars behind that. That's what we need to do. Examine who these folks are reporting to and how they're supported so that they're not going to burn out, because this work is messy, tiring, and very, very energy consuming and emotionally towing. I mean, there's a lot, and it's a lot of times it's folks of color doing this work. They have to also deal with their own personal experiences of racism and then needing to heal, but then ask to also educate. And sometimes it's emotional labor, and so we need to ensure that that we're thoughtful and sensitive in that sense. I think we need to engage. Dr. Nasai Jefferson talked about, coalition building and engaging folks at all levels. It is so important to build coalition in a meaningful and an effective way. And I have to say, when I was a college student at Tufts, I was interning in DC, and I had the honor and privilege of attending that very first White House initiative on race in DC, where President Clinton sponsored the event. And back then, that was in 96, 97. There was the NAACP, National NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, Organization for Chinese American, and National Council of La Raza, coming together for the very first time, comparing and contrasting experiences of being communities of color. And while it was really exciting during that time, it was also so discouraging, because at the end of that initiative, the communities were not able to come together and work together because we were so new at that work, at coalition building and at solidarity building. And now at 2022, right now, we're having so many coalitions that are doing really effective work. And that we're coming together and we're beginning to learn about each other, from each other, hearing each other out, but there's still a lot of work needs to be done so that coalitions are respected and engage in ways that will be meaningful. Because if we, and here's the thing, many organizations become kind of the go-to for, perspectives and for resources and things like that. And if we do it, meaningfully enough, we should continue to reach out to organizations and voices that we don't often heard, or that they're not the ones that you hear on the news all the time, or getting perspective or interviews or political commentaries. There are so many that are doing this work, and they're really on the ground. They're very grassroots. So there has to be a push and a pull effort of bringing out those voices that are not often heard and embraced, and then bring them to the table, and not just getting their voices, but give them power, give them decision-making opportunities so that they can affect change, because they know the issues best. And then of course, the counselor said earlier is that, this work, we got to do personal work on our own. When it's, we need to be uncomfortable with some things that we learn directly from others, that they're saying, this is who we are, these are my issues, we want you to hear us out. And for anybody to hear things for the first time and it makes us feel uncomfortable, we need to deal with that head on, to be courageous and to look and examine our own biases and to say, how can I do better? How can I learn about the issues more? And read and attend events that are not your own community events. Attend, support organizations that are doing this work on the very, on the ground, that are doing events and their fundraising and the things like that, to learn from them directly, to learn from the clients, to learn from the residents, to learn from those who are experiencing the injustice firsthand. Get involved, volunteer at any local organization that is addressing racial justice issues. be that parent that's active and constantly, have the critical lens on DEI, on equity practices and all that, and ask questions and demand answers. If there's resources within your means, donate to the candidates are putting themselves out there to run. Support the campaign, support the people, because at the end, I come to learn that, we got to really make sure the people who are willing to do the hard work as elected officials to stay in office so that they can get the policies through. And if they're not doing it, let them know that they're not doing the work, and find new candidates and elect those new ones, cultivate, use our power of the vote, of our voice. This is democracy. I came from Vietnam as a refugee, and that was a communist country. And I value democracy so much, and it is so value and precious. We got to do our part to uphold democracy, but it's not perfect. It's far from perfect. We're going to have to hold democracy accountable. I mean, we've been hearing we've been, witnessing the hearings on Trump, the insurrection and whatnot. And it's disgusting. It's so sad. And at the same, like blood boiling. But at the same time, we still have process to call these things out. And so we need to do our part to uphold the work of democracy. So I think that we just need to get going, to just act, and be uncomfortable, and just to learn from each other and respect the voices that we don't often hear. I hope these are some examples that can help the community to have more ideas as to what to do to get involved.
I love that. We have to get going. That's it. Thank you, all of you. Wonderful suggestions, examples, ideas. You've really helped us dive deeper into this complex conversation, and the importance of representation that you've touched on. And of course, Councillor Karim-Chety is personally a good example of that, doing this work professionally and as a community activist, and then going into the arena and successfully running for office. And I also want to give
I'm totally interrupting the senator. Sorry.
I just want to give a shout out. We also have with us tonight Stacey Thompson, who is the first Black woman elected in the city of Lowell on the school committee, and is with us, and another great example. And of course, we could give many others. And we are. We're not there by any means in terms of representation, but we are moving the needle, and that's we need to push that harder and faster. So I'm sorry, Manjula, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, I totally interrupted you. I apologize. I was just thinking about like the elected official thing, and just on a personal note, I wanted to share, because and Dr. Josiah Jefferson sort of said this, and I wanted to share on a personal note. Running for city councilor was not something I ever thought that I would do. And I was tapped by other female leaders who said, "Hey, have you thought about running?" And I was like, "What?" And at first I was sort of like, "No, I haven't thought about that. I'm an educator. I'm a school counselor." And it was this group of women, and some were sort of white women already in power, and some were women of color who were in power in other districts. And it was really their encouragement and mentoring that gave me the confidence and the courage to even run. And so I just want to share that, because it's so important to be encouraged, to be a supporter, to share knowledge. And, I wouldn't have done it otherwise, I guess is what I would say. And it really is important for people to have a seat at the table, and to have diversity at the table when it, at all levels of government and schools and in the community. And just, again, I just shared that personally, because it's not something I would have done. I didn't see myself being a politician. I did grassroots community work, and I worked in schools. So this was a leap for me. But people really helped me, and that help matters.
Yep. And might I just add to that for a moment? I think, thank you for being a representative for your community. That's so incredibly important. And we know that, you normally has to have to ask a woman to run 7 times before she seriously considers that. And another thing that we found, when women of color particularly run, they're running because they see a gap in terms of what needs to be done. And they're saying, wait a minute, nobody's doing this. And even if I feel a little inexperienced or I'm not sure, who else is going to do this? So I'm going to step up to the plate and I'm going to make that happen. And I think the other thing that's important, we think about women of color running, is that there's usually more challenges. There's challenges in terms of having the ability to fundraise. And I don't mean the ability, but being able to seek those funds, because you're working full time, you might have children. There's so many obstacles. But what we found in terms of, women of color is that, they're moving forward. But that's just the beginning. Once they get into office, there's also challenges. If we begin to look at people like Michelle Wu and many others, they're very successful, strong women, but it doesn't end there. So I just wanted to add to that. And again, I'm so glad that you are representing your community. Very, very important. And yes.
Excellent. Yes, great. Thank you so much. I'm really glad you're representing Melrose as well and have the chance to work together. So I believe we have several other questions. So let's go to the next question, Kate. And I think it is one that gets at one of the challenges of doing this work. I suspect pretty much most of the people attending tonight are committed to this work and understand, why it's so important, and understand the impact of systemic racism, or at least are committed to learning about systemic racism. But we do know that, in having these conversations, sometimes some white people see this, get defensive or see this as threatening. And of course, we certainly see in some parts of our country efforts to actively shut down these conversations, to censor, what can be taught in our public schools, what kinds of books can be in our public libraries, and to really, censor and whitewash our nation's history. So maybe you can share some thoughts about how to have these conversations sometimes with communities, with white communities that may not be as willing to participate in this work, and may have a different view of where our country's at and even our country's history. So I don't know who wants to tackle this one first.
I'm happy to start. And I want to say I really appreciate this question, because I think this gets at the messiness of the work for sure. And I guess I would start by saying I really, for myself, in doing this anti-racist work, I really take a developmental approach and a growth mindset approach, and really see all of this as a journey. And we're all on this journey of understanding diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. So I really try to follow a philosophy of meeting people where they are, and starting with trying to develop trust, develop relationships, and some understanding. I often try to approach maybe those who are less inclined to take on anti-racist work. Well, where do we connect? What do we have in common? That's one strategy. And so I am someone who is not interested in cancel culture. I'd be interested in other people's perspectives on that and to challenge that, but that's not how I approach the work. I really try to do the work in pulling people in, but also having brave conversations. And when I hear something, I say something, and sort of practicing those pieces. But I think if we just shame and push people away, then we're not going to make as much progress, as opposed to pulling people in and trying to come together when possible. You know, there are some people you're never going to convince, right? But there are a lot of people in the middle. So how do we meet each other where we are? And, you know, some of the strategies for that, and, you know, and these are more localized strategies, and some of which we've taken from Malden, quite honestly, but like our Community Reads program, we had a city, school, and community collaboration that we just launched this year. And we read America Ferrera's American Like Me, which has a diverse array of stories, immigrants, refugees, people of color, LGBTQ community members who wrote personal essays about their version of being American. And we had the city sponsored events, the community sponsored events, but the school department, grades K through 12, actually had the students reading as well. And so there were developmentally appropriate books for our younger students. There were essays that were read by our middle schoolers for our high school students. And so there were music opportunities, there were art opportunities. So there were different entry points for people. And so I don't think shame works. When people are shamed, that triggers a lot of bad behavior, a lot of trauma behavior, a lot of different types of those kinds of things. So I believe strongly in meeting people where they are and growing together. And that acknowledging that it is a journey and we're all on different places, but that there's room for all of us to grow. And I'm so curious, and I would love to hear from the other panelists, because you may disagree with that, and that's okay. That's just the strategy that has worked for me.
I mean, I think that I'm in basic agreement with you on this. And I've done this in a number of different venues with a number of different audiences. So let's start with my master's level students, my PhD students. So, you know, all the classes that I teach are primarily related to race and gender and other social positionalities in reference to policy or something else. And so you have to get students ready. So one of the things that I've done is sort of say, okay, let's think about when you were a child. I want you to think back of when you were a child, when you felt you were treated unfairly, or when a close person of yours was treated unfairly. What was the unfairness? What was the reaction? And so there, as you're mentioning, you're meeting them where they are with something they can identify with, but also something that comes along with strong emotions. And then you begin to make the linkages between their experiences or someone close to them's experiences and what somebody else is experiencing. And you don't say that, you know, race is the same as gender or gender is the same as, you know, nationality, but you do say that these are all ways in which people are stereotyped, people are oppressed, people are in many ways looked through a particular type of lens. That's one thing that I do, and that tends to move the needle. The other thing that I do is really help people think about their identities. And when I'm teaching about intersectionality, one of the things I do is say, you know, identify, tell me who you are. And sometimes I'll do it with an example and I'll start with me, and sometimes I won't. And one of the things I find is that you will get an idea of how people view themselves. And then you'll also see how people view themselves in terms of order. And so, you know, someone might say, I am a Black woman, middle class, you know, whatever it might be. And sometimes there's a rhyme and reason for that order, and having people to explain that. So to help people to understand, number one, how do they identify themselves, but also to help them understand that they have multiple identities, and these multiple identities have implications for who they are within their lives. The other thing that I do that I think is really critically important is to have people to tell stories. One of the things that I do in my classroom and in doing workshops is something called a political autobiography. And so that is a way of making sure that people are looking at how they got to where they are in terms of their passions, in terms of their interests, as it relates to their experiences growing up and moving forward, which really what I find, you know, with students and other people is sometimes people are not quite aware of how they got from point A to point B and what those experiences are all about. And it's critically important that people are reflective, because what I find sometimes happens is that we want to do good, we want to make a difference, and that's really important, but really trying to find a way to identify those motivations, because those motivations need to be clarified for a number of different reasons. And so I think those are some of the really important things. And I think the other thing, I'm going to give one more example from healthcare, which is an area that I've been focusing on for much of my life. And what we found is that, when we began to talk about discrimination in healthcare, discrimination in medicine, and we were trying to make that clear to physicians and other healthcare providers, that was a very, very, very strong pill to swallow. So what we began to do was say, okay, there's discrimination in medicine, and it's out there. Because what we found was if we said you as a white male doctor, or you as a healthcare administrator are doing this, as you were mentioning just a minute ago, people shut down and become defensive, and that's not what you want. So you say this is out here, and then people are able to accept this is out there. And then you say, well, it's in the hospital. Okay, it's in the hospital. Well, it's on your ward, and then keep moving it forward and forward. But you have to give people the ability to sort of see it where they're comfortable seeing it. And then once they're able to accept that, moving that forward. So those are some of the strategies that we've used.
So I want to answer your question there, Counselor, that I do agree with your outlook, and I tend to believe in the goodness of people first. And I think that, telling stories, learning about each other, and connecting in that way, it really helps for all of us to see us as just one another, and start learning about our challenges, right? The political journey, and all that. It does help, and like you said, there's just some folks that we just cannot persuade them or get them to see what privilege is, or racism is still very prevalent, and white supremacy still dominates, and we need to dismantle. But for the most part, I think that we just have to give faith to people that we can all change, and we learn. We need to learn and grow. So throughout their work of advocating for the CARE legislation that Senator Lewis championed this current session, that we've heard from white students talking about their desire to have an anti-racist education, so that they can learn about racism and about their peers, and about how to be just a good citizen, a good neighbor, a non-racist contributing member of some community, whatever community that is, school community, like a town community, whatever it is. They want to have the tools and understanding and knowledge. And when we're hearing this from young people, and then we're also hearing from adults who've had racist parents saying that they don't want to have kids and not know that they've had, they are possessing implicit biases and practices that have been racist, that they picked up from their parents, and now they're imparting that onto their children. And so we're hearing from, many white folks wanting to be good allies, not just allies, but like effective and impactful allies. And I think there are so many spaces where the white allies are so important to getting the work done. And I also want to take a practical approach to say that, I mentioned ethnic studies. Studies have shown that ethnic studies, when students of color get to learn about themselves and their true history in a more decolonized curriculum, they tend to stay in school longer and finish. They get better grades. They perform. It's student outcomes are there to show that it is important that we have that. And so that's very practical. We want students to succeed. And so these curriculums, it's not a deficit platform, it's really asset-based.
Mm-hmm.
Asset-based. When students are learning anti-racist curriculum or learning about themselves and their neighbors for who they are, truly who they are, it's a win-win situation. We
Absolutely.
want our neighbors to be healthy and happy and that they're doing well. It's not that when they are when they have when we teach anti-racist education or when we advance racial justice, that our neighbors will be better than us and therefore we will have less. It's not a zero sum. And so I think that we need to make sure that we understand that it can be very win-win for everybody. And then from the business standpoint, the business community really benefit from diverse workforce, DEI values and things like that. It brings creativity, entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just like it's again there studies out there that shows that you don't want the same type of workforce all the time because we're not going to move and we're not going to think outside the box and we can't compete in the global economy, right? And so these are just really practical things that we're all in this together. Yeah. We really are. We learn and we grow together, and that we have to understand that we are we're not erasing individuality. We're not disrespecting individual histories of communities, but at the same time there are moments where we come together and we collaborate and we build solidarity while we respect individual community history and while we acknowledge the land we stand on that it used to be, that we have stolen this land. We do all these, but we also acknowledge that we can work together and we can work together well and effectively, and that it will be a win-win for all.
Well said. Well, sadly, we are approaching the end of our time together tonight. It's just hard to believe the time has gone by, but I want to just we've covered, you've done such a great job. You've actually addressed almost all the questions that have been coming in. But I wanted to just do a final lightning round. Maybe if you could each basically just impart some wisdom for folks who are thinking about how do they get involved in anti-racism work? How do they get started? And if they are involved, how do they get more involved? So I know this again is, like any of these questions, there's a lot to it. And but maybe if you could just very briefly, maybe just impart some sage advice for folks in terms of doing this important work. So Dr. Nasai Jefferson, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I'll give a couple of things. I think power broking is really important, and that, white people acknowledge their complicity in perpetuating white supremacy, but also that they also have a role in dismantling it and being there at every turn when there's an opportunity to dismantle, to be part of that, support the introduction, advocate for legislation and other initiatives to address inequities in housing, health, and wealth creation, get involved with reforming police departments, ensure that public schools have resources they need for quality education, lobby for equitable, not equal K through 12 funding, because equitable is really the term, do business with banks that are addressing the issue of disproportionate number of loans to Black people being denied. Require that loan officers understand the historic lack of access to capital for people of color. This is what I think is really important, conduct audits to uncover disparate incomes in hiring, retention, performance ratings, involuntary and voluntary determinations, and utilize not just a racial perspective, but an intersectional perspective. And I think the other thing is to conduct what we call reverse engineering process to backtrack and determine where the system of equities kicked in any of these situations. I think that's really important. And also hold leaders accountable for creating inclusive culture that really includes everyone. And I think these are really very, very important. And as was mentioned earlier on, we will be uncomfortable as we're addressing issues of racism, but it's a necessary discomfort. And I think the last thing I want to say is that as it is now, racism does not go away, it adapts. And we have to find a way to make sure that racism goes away and doesn't continually adapt as we try to, as those who in white supremacist position continue to perpetuate it.
Great. Thank Councillor Karamchetti. Your sage advice in 30 seconds.
I think, what I would say is, learn as much as you can about the history and the present in terms of what's going on in your local community. But then I would say find people who are doing the work that you want to do and join with them. It sounds so simplistic, but words aren't enough anymore. It's actions that matter. So link up with someone doing good work and join them in it. We are stronger together. So just jump in. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be an expert. Just try.
Thank you. I would add that, it was such a comprehensive from the doctor there. And yes, just try and lock arms together and do this work, and also allow for us to burn out and then be able to rest and retreat and reinvigorate and heal. We need to heal each other. We need to allow ourselves time and space and resources to heal, because this work is messy and it's so entrenched. And I just want to say that, just going back to legislative support and things like that, legislations like the anti-ACRA or anti-racist education, cultural responsive education legislation, that's so important, because it's, at the end of the day, we want to teach our children a curriculum that will prepare them for this diverse 21st century. And then, and legislations like the Fair Share Act that Senator Lewis is championing as well, that will get the resources to local communities that is so much needed to address so many issues that, we keep saying that we don't have enough money for. And so get involved and just allow us to be uncomfortable, to be excited, to be challenged. If you're challenged, don't step away and don't get discouraged. It may feel very uncomfortable, but have that courage to re-examine and say, what can I do better? Did I do so? And to this day, with the work in this in the field of racial justice and DEI and all that I still get called on. Yes, literally, real example today. We had a meeting on Juneteenth last night for our coalition, and one of our members called us out and say, it was Juneteenth, how come we had a meeting, we didn't observe the holiday, and etc. But we were doing anti-racist work, but at the same time we need to be very mindful and sensitive, and we need to walk the talk. And so we apologize and we say we can do better. And these are things that we have to continuously do, that we have to just continue to reflect and examine the practices. In the name of doing good work, we still can grow and learn and do better. And so we just have to keep that keep that in the forefront and just do it.
Fabulous. I would love to keep this conversation going, but we're gonna have to do it again another time. I want to point folks again to the resource guide that my office has been putting together. That is another way for folks to learn more about anti-racism work. And also point you to organizations, that are doing this work locally and in our region that you can also partner with to do this. So take a look at that, and we welcome your feedback as well on other resources that we can add to that guide, and we want to keep that and build it out and continue to share that with the community. Thank you so much to our wonderful and inspiring panelists. We're so appreciative of your being with us tonight, sharing your wisdom, and most importantly, the work that you are all doing to make our communities more just and equitable. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us. Hope you've really enjoyed this conversation and taken away some good ideas. Yep. Applause for our panelists and for our audience. Thank you again to my team, Kate, Sarah, and Zach, for all your work organizing the event. Thank you. And reminder, we will be planning our next community conversation for the fall, so stay tuned for that. I want to wish everybody a happy Juneteenth, very happy Pride Month, and everyone be well. And again, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
It really has been. Thank you.